Barack Obama locked on to J.D. Vance, ready to deliver a fatal lesson on community organizing, completely oblivious that Vance's laptop held the exact data to dismantle his legacy. Obama locked eyes with J.D. Vance issuing a stern warning not to school, a veteran organizer on the essence of community, reminding everyone he was rallying. Chicago's South Side long before Vance even knew what politics entailed. The room exploded in cheers, reacting as if a final verdict had just been handed down by the only man whose pedigree truly mattered. This exchange immediately went viral because Obama still wielded his signature rhythm, tone, and the refined ability to weaponize a sentence into a public execution before anyone could verify the facts or notice the carefully constructed moral high ground. He dropped the microphone with the calculated precision of a leader who knew political theater was power, not decoration, commanding the eager room as only he could. Yet, Vance completely ignored the spectacle, his eyes glued to a laptop screen displaying a metric far more lethal than any rehearsed jab or dramatic pause, a figure tied to a specific property, a massive price tag, and the American taxpayer. While Obama brought prestige, nostalgia, and political lore to the stage, Vance brought the ultimate kryptonite to political mythology, a verifiable paper trail accessible to anyone willing to stop clapping and read. Billed as a high-minded dialogue on civic duty, presidential legacies, and public service, the event was meticulously structured to give the former president a massive home field advantage, keeping the debate safely quarantined within the uplifting boundaries of inspirational rhetoric. Just 1 month after the inauguration of the Obama Presidential Center, the former president returned to Chicago holding every conceivable edge. Sitting adjacent to his namesake monument, he faced an audience ready for a coronation rather than a critical audit of municipal costs and community impacts. He kicked things off with a 4-minute monologue, eloquently praising the local streets, the mentors who shaped his democratic ideals, and the youths exploring the new facility, weaving a narrative so harmonious that any critique would seem offensive. Pivoting to Vance, he offered a condescending nod to Appalachia before insisting his grassroots door-knocking trumped penning a memoir on economic hardship. The room roared in approval, satisfied the natural hierarchy was intact, and that Obama had neutralized the debate through pure charisma. Vance let 5 seconds pass in total silence. He refused to defend his writing, ignored the slight, and made no attempt to match his opponent's theatrical energy, knowing that doing so meant fighting on Obama's chosen terrain. Instead, he simply asked where Obama currently lived. Those unadorned words shattered the philosophical facade, compelling the self-appointed voice of the South Side to publicly reconcile his working-class persona with his current zip code. The atmosphere plummeted, as the crowd knew his home wasn't in Inglewood, South Shore, or Woodlawn, the communities anchoring his political genesis. His actual residence was Martha's Vineyard, an $11.75 million compound on an elite island, boasting a median property value of $1.3 million. It was a setting so totally detached from the room's financial struggles that his sermon on grassroots solidarity suddenly felt aggressively scripted. Flashing a tight smile, Obama casually stated he lived wherever his family was, hastily attempting to steer the dialogue away from real estate and back toward the broad concept of public service. Service is delightfully vague and sentimental, whereas a multi-million-dollar property deed is ruthlessly exact. Vance didn't push back on the pivot. Instead, he redirected the focus straight to the colossal monument Obama had erected in the very district he purported to uplift, bypassing rhetorical duels in favor of hard financial ledgers. Officially unveiled on the 19th of June, 2026, the Obama Presidential Center claimed 19.3 acres of Jackson Park and amassed a staggering $850 million price tag, eclipsing its preliminary $300 million projection. Bloated to nearly triple its initial budget, this extravagant campus towered over a South Side community burdened by a meager $35,000 median household income, where a quarter of the population languished below the poverty threshold. While this jarring disparity didn't implicitly signal fraud, it served as a brutal testament to the massive disconnect between the utopian PR campaign used to market the facility and the gritty fiscal truth of the adjacent streets. Obama could rebrand the complex as a generational investment, an academic hub, or a civic sanctuary, yet no focus group title could alter reality. An $850 million fortress now overshadowed locals who were desperately struggling to afford basic groceries, transit, and rising property taxes. The Obama Foundation consistently leaned on the defense. This talking point was delivered with such polished frequency that it was obviously designed to terminate any deeper probe into peripheral government spending. Clicking to a new tab, Vance exposed upwards of $350 million disbursed by both the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois for critical overpasses, road expansions, utility shifts, and transit upgrades explicitly mandated by the center's existence. These were hard, taxpayer-funded municipal expenditures. Yet, remarkably, not a single governmental body or foundation press release had ever synthesized these numbers into one transparent document to show the community the true collective bill. Labeling the architecture as purely privately funded while relying on working-class citizens to underwrite the massive logistical networks required to sustain. It was not an honest accounting distinction, it was a clever PR illusion, meant to divorce the shiny building from its concealed public invoice. And Vance hadn't even introduced Denise Williams yet. She was the retired healthcare worker whose skyrocketing lease was about to rip the debate out of macroeconomic theory and drop it into devastating human reality, forcing Obama's lofty promises into a stress test that a smooth baritone voice simply couldn't pass. Denise Williams wasn't a convenient political prop, a demographic abstraction, or a nameless local wheeled out to provide ethical cover for a mega development. She was a flesh-and-blood retired nurse who had anchored herself in Woodlawn for 4 decades. She raised her children on those blocks, clocked 36 years at the University of Chicago Medical Center, dutifully paid her civic dues, took the bus, and observed helplessly as the community she helped build aggressively priced her out, all catalyzed by a monument purportedly erected for people exactly like her. Back in 2019, prior to the groundbreaking, her monthly lease sat at a manageable $1,200. By the hour, the Obama Center finally cut its ribbons. That exact same lease had surged to $1,850. This staggering 54% spike didn't show up in her mailbox, disguised as an inspiring soliloquy. On civic hope, it arrived as a cold, mandatory invoice due every 30 days, entirely indifferent to the museum's tourism metrics. Her family had already been financially exiled from the area, proving that this highly praised civic investment had triggered the most predatory hallmark of modern gentrification, an influx of elite capital that violently displaces the very natives who originally gave the neighborhood its soul. In the 1980s, Obama had cut his political teeth on these precise Woodlawn streets. He knocked on doors identical to Denise's absorbing tales of economic despair and vowing that institutional power should empower the marginalized, not exploit them as a theatrical backdrop. Fast forward to the present, the costliest presidential compound in American history loomed over those exact avenues, and a woman who perfectly embodied the demographic Obama swore to protect was bleeding half her income just to avoid eviction. Shifting his weight, Obama attempted to salvage the narrative, passionately outlining how the campus would act as a massive economic engine. He promised future jobs, global tourism, robust youth programming, and unprecedented access for historically sidelined youths. Vance, refusing to let the debate ascend back into the safe stratosphere of noble intentions, slammed the focus squarely back onto Denise's lease. He bluntly demanded to know if a 54% housing hike was the specific investment she had signed up for. This sharp inquiry laid bare the massive chasm between corporate press releases and grim household realities. Theoretical macroeconomic forecast did absolutely nothing to negate the visceral fact that a retired woman was hemorrhaging cash while her family was forced to pack their bags. That specific question successfully derailed Obama's rhetorical momentum. It wasn't loud or performative. It simply cornered the former president into acknowledging a brutal reality that couldn't be massaged with focus group buzzwords about empowerment and access. Construction gigs generated out in the ether didn't magically subsidize Denise's housing. After-school initiatives didn't move her daughter back to the South Side. And a monumental shrine celebrating the arc of social mobility did absolutely zero to stabilize housing costs for the vulnerable citizens whose struggles provided the emotional foundation for that exact narrative. Vance's interrogation tactic was devastatingly minimalist. Every time Obama attempted to zoom out and paint a majestic portrait of societal progress, Vance mercilessly zoomed in on a single taxpayer, a concrete invoice, or a harsh statistical reality requiring a literal response. The subsequent metric revolved around the actual dirt beneath the building, 19.3 acres of prime Jackson Park real estate. This was publicly owned terrain sustained by municipal taxes, integrated into a historic ecological system, and legally preserved for the everyday citizens who had funded it for over a century. Incredibly, the Obama Foundation secured a 9-year claim to this land for a flat fee of $10. There was no open bidding war to establish its true worth, nor was there any mandate forcing the entity to pay a rate even fractionally aligned with Chicago's commercial real estate standards. Conservative appraisals benchmarking recent neighborhood property sales valued that specific acreage between $20 million and $50 million. In undeniable terms, a staggering fortune in public equity had been discreetly handed over to a private corporation for the cost of a sandwich. This gaping financial deficit couldn't be magically rectified by stamping the project with glowing adjectives like transformative or historic. The unvarnished truth was that municipal leaders had willingly relinquished control of premium land under sweetheart terms that would be instantly denied to local entrepreneurs, community congregations, or housing advocates, none of whom could ever dream of securing a century-long lease with a $10 bill. Vance wasn't accusing the foundation of illegal theft. The city council had formally rubber-stamped the deal. His argument was that bureaucratic legality doesn't equate to fairness, and a rigged municipal vote doesn't convert a colossal taxpayer subsidy into an act of noble philanthropy. For 4 decades, Denise Williams had poured her wages into property taxes, actively subsidizing the upkeep of Jackson Park, only to watch a powerhouse foundation claim 99 years of dominance over it for less cash than she dropped on a 3-0-day bus pass. The sheer optics of the comparison were devastating, distilling a highly convoluted civic contract into elementary school math. A blue-collar senior citizen continuously bleeding capital into the city coffers, while one of the wealthiest political machines on earth handed over a $10 bill to lock down tens of millions in real estate. Attempting a counteroffensive, Obama cited University of Chicago projections, claiming the facility would inject $3.1 billion into the regional economy over 10 years, weaponizing this forecast as proof that the public sacrifice would yield massive dividends. Vance immediately countered by asking exactly whose bank accounts that $3.1 billion would populate. He pointed out that gross economic activity rarely translates to localized financial security. billions of dollars washing over out-of-state developers, luxury hospitality chains, elite landlords, and trendy new bistros provided zero assurance that the actual natives of the neighborhood would possess the capital or housing stability required to ever see a drop of that wealth. An urban sector can rapidly appreciate in market value, while its original inhabitants grow simultaneously poorer against the surging cost of simply existing there. This harsh reality was exactly the blind spot Obama's generalized promises of prosperity relied upon. Pivoting sharply, the former president began praising the facility's upcoming mentorship initiatives, cultural festivals, job training, and the diverse youths who would be inspired by its halls. It was a classic political deflection, enabling him to advertise the campus' noble intentions without ever addressing who was actually hoarding the surrounding financial windfalls. The transition was executed with the signature polish of a man who had spent his adult life practicing how to glide from a damning micro detail into a flattering macro narrative. Yet tonight, the mechanical gears of that maneuver were painfully obvious to the room. And in the theater of debate, once a crowd consciously perceives a rhetorical pivot, it immediately loses its power as a legitimate rebuttal. Vance highlighted the grim historical pattern where massive urban renewal projects are aggressively marketed to struggling communities as a saving grace, even though the modern condos and chic retail spaces are explicitly built for an affluent demographic that hasn't even moved in yet. This cycle leaves the vulnerable local population stranded, watching their neighborhoods' equity explode while the actual profits flow out of state. This is the stark dividing line between building a facility in a zip code versus building it for the people who actually occupy that zip code. Bureaucratic entities constantly obfuscate this difference because holding shiny golden shovels for press photos is vastly more enjoyable than managing a tsunami of eviction papers and displaced generations. The Obama complex could easily hit its $3.1 billion target while completely betraying the very demographic used to legitimize its construction, provided those billions simply hyperinflated property taxes, padded the wallets of external investors, and mutated the South Side into an elite playground that the original locals could no longer financially survive in. Navigating to his next document, Vance shifted the crosshairs away from municipal spending and gentrification, targeting the fundamental legal anatomy of the institution. The building's branding actively conditioned the American populace to view it as a standard presidential library. Historically, these hallowed facilities are strictly governed by the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA. Their core mandate is to safeguard original executive documents, facilitate rigorous academic inquiry, and guarantee citizens uncompromised access to a presidency's factual timeline. However, the Obama Foundation had quietly engineered a totally unprecedented framework. In 2017, the organization formally declared it would bypass the federal archival network entirely. This calculated move permitted the entity to dodge the exhausting regulatory burdens of the federal system, all while continuing to siphon the immense cultural reverence and branding power associated with building a presidential center. Consequently, the actual, authentic documents from the Obama White House were nowhere to be found inside the glittering Jackson Park compound. They were segregated in an undisclosed National Archives facility. This bizarre setup meant that the most exorbitantly priced presidential monument in history completely lacked the primary historical utility that justified its existence in the public mind. The parameters of the debate instantly widened. The core issue wasn't just ballooning budgets, hidden infrastructure bills, or skyrocketing leases anymore. It was a fundamental question of what the taxpayers actually bought after relinquishing their parkland and swallowing massive municipal costs under the guise of funding a sacred historical archive. By formally severing ties with NARA, the Obama Foundation wasn't just expressing a preference for modern aesthetics or digital curation. They were legally dodging a massive federal mandate that forces all official presidential libraries to securely lock away a private endowment equaling exactly 60% of their total building costs. Because the final construction bill skyrocketed to $850 million, remaining in the federal system would have legally obligated the foundation to raise and freeze an astronomical $510 million endowment. That $500 million would have been strictly earmarked for the perpetual maintenance of the library, removing it from the foundation's discretionary slush fund. Opting out of the system effectively vaporized that requirement, immediately granting the organization's executives unchecked, absolute dominion over architectural choices, daily operations, personnel, and global messaging. They operated entirely unburdened by the tedious federal red tape that heavily regulates every other presidential library in the country. This wasn't some minor, accidental, bureaucratic loophole. It was the ultimate strategic victory of their legal maneuvering. The American voter was actively manipulated into viewing the complex as a solemn government institution, while the foundation aggressively protected the limitless agility of a private political corporation, successfully avoiding a $500 million anchor in the process. The end product of this legal maneuvering was a sprawling campus equipped with a museum, a high-end basketball facility, a community garden, a scenic rooftop play area, an artificial sledding slope, and the opulent corporate offices of the Obama Foundation itself. The only thing missing was the actual executive records necessary to validate the building's prestigious moniker. Because those vital documents were marooned at a separate federal site, visiting academics and historians were physically unable to walk into the lauded Jackson Park facility and analyze the raw papers of the 44th Commander-in-Chief, an activity seamlessly accommodated at any normal presidential archive. The complex had essentially hijacked the profound historical gravity of the presidency without bearing a single ounce of the heavy archival labor that traditionally earned that respect. It was an astonishingly self-serving setup for a corporate entity demanding premier public real estate, limitless infrastructure backing, and absolute civic obedience. Vance stripped away the marketing fluff, bluntly identifying the complex by its true operational DNA, a private political headquarters featuring a retail gift shop, some pleasant recreational amenities, and an incredibly costly stone monolith sitting on public grass. That clinical assessment only felt abrasive because it violently peeled back the insulated layers of legacy, revealing the raw, tangible elements that local residents were actually subsidizing. Vance then took aim at the foundation's highly prized 501c3 tax-exempt status. Retaining this elite classification legally mandates that the organization operate almost exclusively for verifiable educational and charitable ends, strictly forbidding it from acting as an untaxed billboard for private political clout. In the eyes of federal tax law, educational status is not a decorative badge awarded simply because a famous politician occasionally delivers a speech, sponsors a local youth camp, or sets up interactive displays highlighting his own career highlights. The legal status demands concrete, measurable public utility, rigorous academic instruction, objective scholarly research, legitimate historical preservation, and programming that tangibly pushes the boundaries of human knowledge rather than merely acting as a PR vehicle to inflate the brand and reach of the property's owners. Certainly, the facility hosted various museum tours and public events, but its glaring failure to house primary executive documents, its refusal to integrate into the National Archival Network, and its deliberate evasion of federal transparency metrics severely undercut its claims of historical duty. Vance's piercing inquiry questioned whether objective education was truly the guiding mission of the campus, or if that word was simply a convenient legal shield deployed to insulate an $850 million private compound from the heavy financial obligations inherently tied to its public perception. An indoor basketball gym can host local tournaments, a garden can occasionally feature agricultural classes, and a sledding slope is fine public recreation, but absolutely none of those perks adequately justified why the entity demanded the sacred title of a presidential center, while running from the very legal framework designed to safeguard presidential history. The issue wasn't that building a park was sinister. The problem was a glaring asymmetry. Every single community amenity mysteriously broadened the foundation's legal leeway, while every discarded federal mandate conveniently shrank its accountability. The organization aggressively sought the unquestioned reverence of a national archive, the massive financial loopholes of an educational nonprofit, the boundless agility of a private corporate entity, and the sweeping zoning power of a state-backed public works initiative. More importantly, they wanted all these perks simultaneously without permitting a single category to enforce its standard restrictive regulations. It was a politically masterful cocktail. The PR team could instantly weaponize whichever label suited their immediate needs and abandon it the second it became cumbersome. This strategy boxed critics into an impossible corner, making them appear as though they were maliciously attacking minority youth programs, public green spaces, the preservation of Black history, and an iconic president's legacy all at once. Vance completely dismantled this psychological trap, aggressively evaluating the entity exactly as he would any mega corporation hoarding unprecedented government subsidies, focusing entirely on its legal DNA rather than its glossy marketing brochures. Next came the legal bombshell, a massive $40 million lawsuit initiated in early 2025 by a prominent Black-owned concrete subcontractor hired to build the complex. The explosive filing formally accused the project's elite management tier of actively sabotaging the foundation's heavily publicized mandates regarding workplace equity, diversity, and minority economic inclusion. As Vance detailed the specifics of the litigation, he highlighted the contractor's claim that Black-owned construction outfits were systematically targeted and heavily penalized for routine errors, while identical or worse infractions committed by non-minority crews on the exact same site were consistently met with leniency. This documented pattern of behavior stood in violent, hypocritical contrast to the Foundation's holiest public vows. The severe allegation was a direct missile strike on the project's most heavily guarded moral fortress, considering the entire campus was deliberately planted in a historically Black zip code, bore the name of the nation's first Black commander-in-chief, and was relentlessly sold to the public as the ultimate engine for systemic racial justice. A discrimination lawsuit leveled by a Black-owned firm working directly on the site wasn't some fabricated right-wing smear campaign engineered by outside agitators. It was a furious internal mutiny detonating from within, the very workforce held up as proof of the center's righteous intent. No amount of beautifully drafted PR-vetted statements regarding inclusion could erase the agonizing reality that a minority firm, explicitly hired to symbolize that promise, was now demanding a massive payout while accusing the elite leadership of profound bias. For years, Obama's team had monopolized microphones to preach about revolutionizing commercial construction, vowing to funnel massive economic windfalls directly into the pockets of the historically marginalized laborers who usually missed out on urban gentrification booms. Those pledges weren't supposed to be empty political poetry. Subcontractors had bet their livelihoods on those words. Desperate local activists had defended the controversial building because of those words. And powerful city bureaucrats had wielded those exact words to politically excuse handing over public parkland and a fortune in infrastructure upgrades. If the grim details of the lawsuit held up in a court of law, the foundation would be staring down a crisis far deadlier than a standard commercial squabble over poured concrete. The litigation was poised to determine whether the entity's grand racial equity pledges were actual, binding legal covenants or merely cynical, focus group bait designed to secure municipal building permits. The optical contradiction was violently undeniable. An $850 million monument designed to canonize black political triumph in a black community was currently fighting a multi-million-dollar legal war over claims it had actively discriminated against black workers. Vance didn't bother using dramatic adjectives to spice up the allegations. The raw, unadorned math of the situation was sufficiently lethal on its own. With a deliberate click, he closed his final digital tab. Dropping his volume, he intentionally steered the room away from the dry syntax of IRS codes and municipal zoning laws, navigating straight toward the glaring, personal hypocrisy eating away at the core of Barack Obama's curated persona. Looking across the stage, Vance stated he genuinely believed that the idealistic young community organizer who touched down in Chicago in the 1980s had possessed a deep, authentic love for the people of Woodlawn, the families in Altgeld Gardens, and the neglected districts where citizens battled daily against institutional decay. That young man had sat at cramped kitchen tables, absorbed the bitter dialect of systemic neglect, and masterfully constructed a global political movement around the core philosophy that massive, wealthy power structures must be held utterly accountable to the vulnerable people forced to endure their policies. However, Vance noted, the impeccably dressed billionaire currently sitting on stage, a man legally tethered to a $10 century-long land grab, $350 million in hidden municipal subsidies, an $850 million private fortress, and hyper-accelerating local eviction rates shared absolutely zero DNA, with the humble street organizer praised at the start of the night. Vance wasn't claiming Obama was born heartless. He was pointing out that unimaginable levels of global elite success had forged an astronomical, unbridgeable void between the empathetic young man who knocked on working-class doors and the untouchable titan whose concrete shrine was now aggressively manipulating the market value of the dirt beneath those exact same doors. Vance recentered the debate on Denise Williams, utilizing her crushing financial reality to make that philosophical void painfully quantifiable, knowing that hard, measurable fiscal damage is infinitely more difficult for a politician to wriggle out of than generalized accusations of hypocrisy. The empathetic street organizer from the ADS would have instantly, viscerally grasped exactly what a sudden 54% rent spike meant to an elderly nurse surviving on a rigid pension. He would have intuitively known how terrifyingly fast a modest neighborhood property boom translates into skipping meals, rationing prescription meds, or watching yet another loved one be economically expelled from the city limits. The elite former president, furiously defending his architectural marvel, was perfectly capable of delivering beautiful monologues about billions in macroeconomic forecasts, global tourist metrics, elite academic curation, and the profound historical gravity of his legacy. Yet not a single one of those lofty statistics provided a functional answer as to whether Denise's daughter could still afford to sleep in her own bed. Vance concluded that the humble organizer and the billionaire builder were, for all intents and purposes, two completely different human beings. One was forged by the desperate cries of the marginalized. The other was shielded by a corporate entity, so terrifyingly powerful it could muscle a major American metropolis into surrendering prime parkland for a $10 bill. This wasn't delivered as a cheap debate stage insult. It was simply the brutal, logical conclusion drawn directly from the exact financial ledgers Obama had spent the entire night trying to bury underneath soaring moral poetry. The screen of Vance's laptop faded to black erasing the spreadsheets and legal PDFs from physical sight. Yet the devastating arithmetic hung heavily in the dead silence of the room. The audience had already witnessed exactly how the brutal math interlocked. $10 had bought a century of absolute control over public property. $350 million represented the massive infrastructure invoice secretly offloaded onto the working class. $850 million had birthed the most lavishly expensive presidential complex in human history. $510 million represented the massive federal oversight requirement the foundation had legally engineered its way out of. And $40 million was the price tag of a severe discrimination lawsuit attacking the very soul of the institution's racial justice marketing. Barack Obama undeniably retained every natural political superpower, an iconic vocal register, a historic aura, blinding global fame, and the fierce emotional devotion of his base. But in mere minutes, Vance had aggressively strip-mined the mythology, boiling the soaring debate down to a cold, unforgiving financial ledger where every single one of Obama's inspirational promises was now handcuffed to a deeply uncomfortable public invoice. The former president was still entirely capable of delivering a far superior, more beautifully sculpted speech than anyone else alive, and every soul in the gallery knew this fact before he even moved his jaw. The only lingering question was whether even the legendary oratorical magic of Barack Obama was potent enough to successfully hypnotize a crowd into unhearing the brutal numeric realities they had just been exposed to. Gathering himself, Obama leaned gracefully into the microphone and unleashed the exact caliber of transcendent, soaring rhetoric that had originally rocketed him from the gritty wards of Chicago straight into the Oval Office. It was a flawlessly executed 3-minute masterclass defending civic duty, the unstoppable march of racial progress and his grand legacy. He vividly painted an emotional portrait of a hypothetical little girl from the struggling streets of Englewood walking through the center's doors and finally seeing her own reflection permanently etched into the grand American narrative. Every single syllable was architecturally perfect. He had engineered it with the immense discipline of a leader who had spent 4 decades mastering exactly when to deploy a dramatic pause, precisely when to drop his volume to an intimate whisper, and flawlessly knowing how to let a soaring moral platitude float majestically above the ugly, complicated details rotting beneath it. He spoke eloquently of cementing institutions that could withstand the test of time, referenced the long, bending arc of the moral universe, and fiercely defended the stubborn necessity of hope, even when bitter political cynics attempted to degrade the noble calling of public service into a mere accounting exercise. Evaluated strictly as a performance, the monologue was breathtakingly elegant, emotionally lethal, and undeniably stronger than anything any other living politician could have possibly summoned under such intense, unexpected fire. However, despite its sheer auditory brilliance, the speech completely failed to answer the math. It offered zero explanation for the $10 land grab, the $850 million price tag, the $350 million taxpayer burden, the legally avoided $510 million endowment, the 54% rent spike, or the massive $40 million equity lawsuit. Consequently, the surrounding gallery reacted in a manner Obama had almost never experienced in his charmed political life. It wasn't that the room broke into hostile jeering, nor did they sit in stunned, dramatic silence. Instead, they offered a tepid applause that started out of pure, conditioned muscle memory, but noticeably failed to swell, completely failing to evolve into the rapturous, roaring, standing ovation that his team had considered an absolute guarantee. For years, this specific demographic had been deeply trained to automatically surrender to the musical rhythm of Obama's prose. Yet tonight, they found themselves psychologically forced to weigh that beautiful rhythm against a set of cold, hard numbers that were blunt enough to survive outside the insulated bubble of that specific auditorium. His speech had glided effortlessly over the evidence without ever daring to actually engage with it. It was incredibly beautiful, but utterly weightless. Meanwhile, the damning statistics remained chained to the floor, permanently tethered to the seizure of public parks, hidden municipal spending, skyrocketing neighborhood evictions, and the highly engineered legal evasion of the foundation itself. The core crisis was no longer a question of whether Obama still possessed the raw talent to move a crowd he undeniably did. The true crisis was whether vague inspiration was still a viable defense mechanism after Vance had aggressively dragged the highly specific, unanswered questions out into the brutal light of day. In that exact moment, Obama's unparalleled rhetorical excellence stopped looking like the absolute command of a seasoned statesman and began looking suspiciously like a master class in political evasion, executed at the highest conceivable level. Knowing the trap had snapped shut, Vance made absolutely no attempt to interrupt. He didn't gloat, he didn't smirk, and he wisely refused to try and win the moment by throwing in another sharp one-liner, knowing full well that speaking again would only dilute the massive, unspoken realization that had just settled over the crowd. He simply shut his laptop, took a slow, deliberate sip from his water glass, and calmly allowed Obama's hollow, beautiful final sentences to hang in the silent air right next to the brutal, unyielding evidence, rather than desperately trying to compete with the fading echo of the former president's legendary voice. The quiet, almost boring nature of Vance's reaction made the resulting visual contrast infinitely more damaging to Obama. The former president had panicked and fired up the massive, soaring machinery of historic presidential oratory, while Vance simply behaved like a tired accountant who had just finished running a routine spreadsheet audit and found absolutely zero logical reason to argue with the final totals. Standing in the darkened shadows of the stage wings, the senior architects of Obama's communications empire watched the crowd's muted reaction with a sickening dread. They instantly realized that the highly anticipated event was no longer generating the triumphant, dominant PR imagery they had spent weeks planning to clip and aggressively push online. A massive pre-written fundraising blast sitting in their drafts under the punchy subject line, Obama versus Vance, was quietly aborted. The team recognized that begging their loyal donor base for campaign cash immediately following a viral confrontation focused entirely on the exorbitant, taxpayer-subsidized cost of Obama's own private monument risked turning their entire political operation into a humiliating act of self-parody. When the dust finally settled, the very first video snippet to completely hijack the ensuing 2 4-hour news cycle wasn't actually Vance's most aggressive question. Surprisingly, it was Obama's soaring final monologue, directly paired with the audience's glaring, highly visible refusal to rise out of their seats for it. That specific footage rapidly amassed roughly 29 million views across social platforms, spreading like wildfire under a devastating 4-word caption that Obama's massive PR machine was utterly powerless to censor or spin the speech that failed. The reason this particular clip was so incredibly lethal wasn't because Obama had delivered a stumbling poor performance. It was lethal precisely because he had spoken with absolute historic perfection. And yet, despite all of that unmatched talent, he had still entirely failed to pull the room past the cold, hard financial data they had just absorbed. A weak, fumbling speech could have easily been written off by the friendly press as a rare-off night. However, a phenomenally strong, perfectly delivered speech that still failed to restore the audience's blind faith suggested something far more terrifying, a fundamental structural collapse in the actual power of political presentation itself. The tepid, unenthusiastic reaction of the audience became the ultimate piece of visual evidence proving to tens of millions of online voters that even Barack Obama's absolute greatest political superpower, his voice had finally collided with a boundary of truth that it simply could not penetrate. The second viral clip to emerge focused exclusively on the absurd $10 land lease. It was the exact, easily digestible metric that instantly mutated a wildly complex, boring municipal zoning agreement into a blazing nationwide controversy that was immediately understandable to anyone, requiring zero specialized legal training, no deep-seated partisan loyalty, and no insider knowledge of Chicago's notoriously corrupt political machine. Over 14 million viewers watched intently as Vance clearly mapped out how the Obama Foundation had successfully seized 99 years of total developmental dominance over 19.3 acres of prime, public parkland for a mere $10, all while independent real estate appraisals placed the actual value of that property somewhere between $20 million and $50 million. This specific clip rapidly circulated through the tense networks of city planning groups, fiery municipal forums, furious neighborhood coalitions, and grassroots political organizations where the controversial transfer of public land was never a philosophical debate, but a constant bitter street fight over community ownership, predatory gentrification, and government accountability. Within a week of the clip exploding online, 3 different Chicago aldermen were forced to publicly demand a thorough, transparent review of the lease terms. They didn't do this because they believed the ironclad agreement could be easily ripped up, but because the political cost of leaving the sweetheart deal completely unexamined had suddenly become significantly higher than the cost of blindly defending it. Once the general public clearly saw the $10 figure, the city government could no longer safely hide behind the dense, protective complexity of the contract's legal jargon. The third massive clip to sweep the internet centered entirely on the story of Denise Williams. It specifically highlighted the grotesque, infuriating comparison between the cost of her monthly public transit pass and the foundation's total payment for nearly a century of prime public land. The brutal fact that Denise paid more out of her fixed senior citizen income to ride the city bus for a single month than the multi-million-dollar Obama Foundation paid to seize total control of a massive chunk of her local park for 99 years was a juxtaposition so absurdly, painfully simple that it didn't even register as standard political mudslinging. It simply traveled as undeniable basic arithmetic. This clip organically reached roughly 12 million views because it required no grand political speech to understand, no complex historical framework to contextualize, and absolutely no pre-existing loyalty to J.D. Vance to appreciate. It only required the viewer to possess the basic cognitive ability to recognize that $15 is a larger number than $10. That devastating, relatable comparison instantly transformed Denise from a vague, symbolic local resident into the undeniable human metric by which this massive public arrangement negotiated behind closed doors by institutions vastly more powerful than she could ever hope to be would be judged by history. It also effectively guaranteed that any future politician or spokesperson attempting to defend the lease would be forced to publicly explain on live television exactly why a struggling retired healthcare worker paid more for basic transportation than a billionaire-backed presidential foundation paid for generations of exclusive land use. The political fallout was remarkably swift and merciless. Within the first 7 days following the debate, 4 sitting U.S. senators, a coalition that notably included both Republicans and independents, formally requested that the Government Accountability Office compile a comprehensive, consolidated audit of every single taxpayer-funded infrastructure, expenditure, even remotely connected to the sprawling Obama Presidential Center. This aggressive federal request zeroed in on the most embarrassing, undeniable fact that the confrontation had dragged into the light, that not a single city department, state agency, or foundation press release had ever produced one complete, transparent figure detailing the total sum of public money being pumped into a project that was relentlessly falsely marketed to the public as being entirely privately funded. Simultaneously, a prominent watchdog organization specializing in tax-exempt entities submitted a massive, highly detailed formal complaint to the Internal Revenue Service. This filing aggressively questioned whether the foundation's bizarre operational structure was actually legally consistent with its stated tax-protected educational mission. The document specifically highlighted the glaring absence of any actual presidential records on the premises, the highly suspicious decision to legally opt out of the rigorous National Archives system, and the reality that the massive center largely operated as a lucrative museum, a sprawling recreational campus, and a private corporate headquarters. The IRS officially responded, confirming receipt, which instantly gave the controversy an institutional legal life that extended far beyond a single televised debate. It effectively forced the foundation to prepare to defend its very existence in the strict, unforgiving language of federal tax law rather than the fluffy, protective language of legacy and hope. As the fallout dragged into its second week, 3 Chicago aldermen formally introduced a new municipal resolution. This legislation explicitly required that any future transfers of public city land to private foundations must automatically include independent, fair market value assessments and mandatory competitive open bidding. While the carefully worded measure did not explicitly name Obama in the text and made no legal attempt to retroactively cancel his existing $10 lease, the underlying political purpose of the bill was blindingly obvious to everyone in the city. Governments typically only rush to write new, restrictive rules immediately after suddenly discovering that their old, lax rules had legally permitted a transaction that the voting public now considered to be utterly, morally indefensible. Concurrently, the massive $40 million legal claim regarding workplace equity officially moved into the brutal discovery phase. Attorneys representing the black-owned construction firm began aggressively seeking all internal, unvarnished communications, emails, text messages, memos sent between the Obama Foundation executives and the project's lead construction managers concerning their actual behind-the-scenes handling of diversity and compliance mandates. This terrifying legal process threatened to entirely replace the foundation's polished, PR-approved public statements about racial equity with the raw, unfiltered reality of private emails, blunt instructions, hidden performance reports, and the lark, and cold financial decisions made far away from the flashing cameras. A monumental project that had cynically used the concept of inclusion as its central moral justification for existing was now being legally forced, under oath, to prove whether that inclusion had actually governed its behavior when massive contracts, serious money, and corporate liability were on the line. By the time the third week rolled around, independent housing data secured by local journalists through aggressive public records requests revealed a devastating reality. The data showed that the average residential rents in the immediate Woodlawn neighborhood had exploded by a staggering 48% since 2019, while rents in the adjacent South Shore community had skyrocketed by 31%. Both of these localized spikes were massively, noticeably higher than the overall citywide rent increase, which sat at a comparatively modest 19%. While this data did not legally definitively prove that the construction of the center was the sole exclusive cause of every single rent hike in the area, it absolutely undeniably confirmed the exact grim pattern that Vance had described on that stage. The neighborhood was rapidly becoming prohibitively expensive at a terrifying rate, directly threatening the very existence of the working-class residents whose historical presence had been shamelessly used in brochures to justify the massive development in the first place. Desperate to change the narrative, the Obama Foundation's PR team responded by blasting out press releases highlighting the fact that 43,000 tourists had visited during the center's first 2 weeks, alongside glowing statistics about community programming, youth participation rates, and highly optimistic projections of future economic benefits. However, those impressive-sounding figures merely describe the institution's output. Meanwhile, Denise's crushing rent increase and her daughter's forced, tearful departure from the city describe the actual neighborhood outcome. The vast, tragic difference between those two distinct categories was the fundamental argument that Barack Obama had never been able to answer. The center could count its wealthy visitors, proudly announce its new programs, and throw as many celebrity-studded ribbon cuttings as it wanted, but absolutely none of those glossy achievements proved that the everyday people who actually lived nearby would still be financially able to remain in their own homes. When people look back at the footage, they had to admit that Obama's final speech remained objectively, undeniably beautiful. No honest observer, regardless of political affiliation, needed to pretend otherwise. But on that night, the concepts of beauty and truth had been violently, permanently separated in the public view by a younger man armed with nothing more than a laptop and a devastating sequence of verifiable numbers. Yay! Vance had not defeated Barack Obama by speaking more eloquently or elegantly, because he simply lacked the capacity to do so. Furthermore, he had not even attempted to replace Obama's towering political mythology with a competing mythology of his own. His strategy was far simpler and far more lethal. He had simply taken the former president's soaring, emotional language about community and securely chained it to the actual market price of the land, the massive scale of the hidden public subsidies, the highly questionable legal structure of the private foundation, and the brutal, measurable financial cost imposed on the vulnerable residents trying to survive in the shadow of the monument. Once those metrics were laid bare and the true distance was measured, the vast, hypocritical canyon separating the humble organizer who once knocked on doors and the elite billionaire president whose foundation now controlled the public park for a $10 bill could never again be paved over by the sheer beauty of a vocal cadence. The numbers stubbornly remained the numbers. The address stubbornly remained the address. And the undeniable, infuriating truth remained that Denise Williams was still paying more money for a single month on a city bus than the Obama Foundation had paid to control 99 years of her neighborhood park.